Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. Thank you so much, Paige, Chelsea, Megan, and Gabrielle, for your discussion of chapter 3. You offered a lot of information for us to think with, and this week, together, we're going to be spending more time in your virtual collaboratory groups to unpack some of the ideas proposed and to flesh out together what some of these ideas, these big ideas, mean in early childhood education. So this week, you're going to participate in your virtual collaboratory session and collectively write a post to the Group 2 chapter discussion forum. And there are guidelines that are posted for this group submission in the week 4 section of eLearn, and I'll discuss that more in a few minutes. So post-structural theory posits that there's no absolute or sole child or childhood, but rather that childhood is constructed. And so this week we thought with Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence in the readings in considering childhood and the image of the child from several different perspectives. So borrowing from Silvana Caprice, if we're interested in education, and if we're interested in pedagogy as a social science study, then we always must begin in thinking with an idea of who is the human and who is the child. So with this, we're considering what are the theories that inform these discourses, creating our understanding or image of the child. So this image of the human subject is intimately linked with the purpose of education. Why do we educate? What kind of subject are we trying to create in this project of education? What kind of human are we trying to create? So there are multiple constructions of childhood that are situated within particular socio-geographic locations and theoretical assumptions. So the construction of the child is informed by how we think children are and ought to be. So scientific discourses create a particular understanding of the child, one which positions children as essentialized and naturalized, and within a baseline of developmental psychology that assumes who the child is and will become. So the division of infant, child, youth, and adult, and these linear stages of progression through life, are created within social and cultural contexts, which then determine childhoods. So these transitions across a lifespan are not at all universal. So let's consider together with a critical eye developmental psychology and the idea that's proposed to us in the text that there are actually these are actually assumptions that are dependent upon social, cultural, and political milieu. So it can be argued that child developmental theory has been and is an expansive and colonial tool that's naming a baseline of what a quality childhood ought to look like and how to attain it. But this doesn't necessarily mean that these rationalities of who the child is or the experiences of living childhood are actually universal. There are many cultural factors and geographic factors that influence how childhood is lived. And so then developmental psychology becomes quite tension because it assumes a universality of the child. So this is visible in child's rights discourses, where children's needs are treated as self-evident and neutral, without consideration of specific cultural contexts and times. Moreover, children are positioned in a state of lack, where they're entitled to particular services that perpetuate these developmental logics in the service of their supposed well-being. But this well-being is informed by a Euro-Western assumption. So a dominant discourse in early childhood education is that of the competent child. We hear about children's competencies very much in this field. The assumption that the child is already arriving full and comes with competence that is given. There's this innate imagination, there's this innate knowledge inside the child. So if this is true, and we take this image of the the child as truth, then the role of the educator is merely to provide children with experiences that enable them to discover this inner potential, this inherent creativity and pre-existing rationale. The formed self is already there. So this construction of the child can be critiqued because this construction of the child ignores the milieu in which children live and the social dynamics that are constantly making childhood. And following Caprice, the problem with competence discourses is that it positions children as already made, already knowing. However, children need to be educated in order to think with complexity. This is what Caprese suggests to us. If the human subject is in constant relation with the milieu in which they're existing, then pedagogy must also be in response to this changing milieu. Nothing is static. So pedagogy then is not a static practice or something that can be applied or an approach or model that is implemented. Pedagogy is a response with a social responsibility and intentionality to creating educational conditions and experiences that are in dialogue with the complexity of a child's milieu, their social context and political times in which they're living. So it's a way of forming and creating subjectivities, creating humans that will allow the human to live well in a particular time. So pedagogy then is not necessarily interested in creating happy children, but rather thinking children. So next week we're going to discuss further the child in neoliberal times and think about who is the child allowed to be in discourses of happy childhoods. And we'll be thinking with Cristina Delgado Ventimiglia in that next week. So who we think the child is intimately informs our pedagogical work. If we view the child as an empty vessel waiting to be filled, the child as a sponge, there will be particular orientations to pedagogy that are based on this image, and the role of the educator will be informed by these assumptions. So this image of the child as a sponge, as a receiver of knowledge, supposes a transmission of knowledge from the outside in. It's not so much of a dialogue or response in relation, but rather it's something that's coming from outside to fill the empty child. In some ways, this is kind of the opposite of the image of the child as competent, because the child is not full, seeking, giving out knowledge. In this context, the child, or in this image, the child is empty, seeking to be filled. So in this sense, knowledge is not co-constructed, but disseminated. So a teacher then, an educator, becomes a transmitter or facilitator of learning. And as Biesta writes, a sort of process manager, where the teacher is somehow separate from the act of teaching. So here, in some ways, environments also lose their agency and value because they only become in the service of the learning child as an instrument to fill the empty child with information and with knowledge. So the relational codependencies between child, educators, materials, and place are ignored in the service and instrumentality of the learning child as the beneficiary. So if we look to childhood as a preparatory age, this image of the child as in service of an economic contribution, children acquire knowledge and skills in order to be successful in job markets and ensure the economic stability of the nation state. So if we're looking at the child from this lens and this image, pedagogy then will likely be focused on skills-based learning, where educators ensure that children are able to perform particular skills that will then serve them in the future and be independent in this. So the hope for the child is that they will be autonomous, a self-sufficient contributor, a consumer within neoliberal markets. So the purpose of education and the ways of thinking that are created within this rationality are in the pursuit of this kind of human subject. And next week, we're also going to go further into this discussion about who is the child in the neoliberal state and how this then informs common pedagogical orientations in early childhood education. So next week, we're going to discuss Chapter 4 and investigate the early childhood institution within times of advanced capitalism. And we're going to unsettle some of the taken for granted logics about what early childhood education is often imagined as being for. So in our reading of Chapter 3 this week, we were offered several images of the child that are very common in early childhood education. The child as knowledge, identity, and culture producer, the child as innocent and in the golden age of life, the child as nature, or as the scientific child of biological stages, the child as labor and market supply factor, and the child as co-constructor of knowledge, identity, and culture. So this week in your VC groups, you're going to investigate one of these constructions of childhood and create an image of the child that will be shared and discussed on eLearn. So these can be point form, but should be a thorough examination of who the child is within this particular view, as it was discussed by Paige, Chelsea, Megan, and Gabrielle in their talk, and also as you've read in the text this week. So you're going to be considering an image of the child, of the human subject, and how it's intimately linked with the purpose of education. So you're going to be thinking about, why do we educate? What kind of subjects are we trying to create in the project of education?